vast world of Filipino culture. I want to thank my mom for being here today, and thanks to you and Robert, I'm here standing 1 week away from graduation. And to all my friends that came to attend, I hope this will be worthwhile. And to my girlfriend Juana for your patience and your willingness to listen and dialogue. And that alone reaches deeper into my heart than you can imagine. So the title of my presentation is Living in America, an American Empire, the Filipino Male Body. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a personal history. When I started this thesis project, I started with the question, what does it mean to be Filipino in America? And it's a question that's both personal and political. So personally, I owe it to my grandparents, both maternal and paternal, for being here in the United States. And they immigrated here after the passing of the 1965 immigration law, which raised the quotas for how many Asians can come to America, which was previously set at a really low number. It was only, I think, 50 people from Asia can come each year until 1965. And let's see. So I came here, to look for economic stability, social stability, political stability, and over time and hard work, these things were achieved. However, there was an adverse effect in the education system that really pushed for everyone in the household to speak English and not encouraging bilingualism. A lot of social pressures to fit in, a lot of economic pressures to fit in the workplace, and also a reasoned willingness to acquiesce. There was definitely a loss of culture. So what I do know about this huge term, Filipino culture, I do know food. I know what chicken adobo is. I know what sinigang is, palabok, tapsilog, and I do know how to count to 10 in Tagalog. And aside from that, that's essentially all I know from what is traditionally perceived as Filipino culture. So politically, what it means to be Filipino, there's a lot of implications for that in terms of religion, in terms of who I am as a working person eventually, who I am as a writer, who I am as a citizen paying taxes, who I am as not only a Filipino and American in America, but also a Filipino American and male in America. And these questions delve into politics, race, cultural identity, sexuality, and masculinity, which is how I arrived upon my thesis statement, which is America's imperialist, racial, and gendered gaze of the Filipino male body has governed the experience of Filipino males as colonial subjects, immigrant workers, and American-born residents. And I'll explain the history behind how I came to this thesis statement. But with this thesis statement, I decided to take a creative direction with my project, and I decided to write, of course with the permission from my advisors, a collection of poems. And here's the history that informed my work. So let's start with the Philippine-American War. It's definitely a war that is left out of American textbooks, at least in my curriculum growing up. And here it's important to see the Filipino male body as a colonial subject that is to be controlled and even slaughtered. The war lasted from 1898 to 1902, and the president at the time was William McKinley, this man right here, and he had this to say amidst the war to justify it to the media. I went down on my knees and prayed to Almighty God for light and guidance more than one night, and one night late it came to me this way. There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them, as their fellow men whom Christ also died. So staying in line with certainly the manifest destiny and a lot of the sacred elements, mixing it with the political as well, and certainly a lot of racial superiority. So the war, these are Filipino soldiers. The war left 4,000 American soldiers dead, which was more than double the amount of American soldiers that died in the Spanish-American War. It left 20,000 Filipino soldiers dead, and over 200,000 Filipino civilians died. largely due to disease and starvation. And throughout the war, many Filipino prisoners of war were executed, tortured, and American soldiers burned and looted towns. And in this depiction here, it's what was called the water cure, and it's essentially they invented waterboarding, so way before the Iraq War. And this is what William Taft, who was then the governor of the Philippines, had to say about it. This is showing that he had knowledge about it in a Senate Commission hearing. I believe it involves pouring water down the throat so that the man swells and gets the impression that he is going to suffocate, and then tells what he knows. So we're going to move on toward the colonial period, which lasted until 1946, in which the Philippines was the colony of the United States. And to kind of capture the colonial attitudes, we're going to turn to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And here, the Filipino male body is to be seen as a spectacle or a human zoo animal. So one of the main attractions, actually the main attraction for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair was the Filipino reservation, specifically the Igorot village, in which they took about 100 natives from their tribe in the mountains of the northern region of the Philippines, and they enticed them with money, certainly, enticed them with all these notions of what America could be, enticed them with the possibilities of education, and they brought them here simply to to be, as I said, human zoo animals, and they upheld this idea with what scientists and anthropologists argued as this progression towards civilization. And in this quote, it says, "Scientists have declared that with the proper training, they are susceptible to a high state of development." And what they would do is they would make them do their very traditional dances, which have a very sacred value, but they would make them do it daily. They would make them slaughter dogs and eat them on a daily basis, which was only done at a very, very rare traditional time. So they really took the sacred elements of these people and turned it into entertainment. And as you can see, there was a lot of focus on the body themselves of these Igorot villagers from the Philippines. In the pamphlet to advertise the tribes, it says, "Probably no tribe in the archipelago can produce such splendid specimens physically." And here you see the First Lady at the time, Miss Roosevelt, and her friends. They're amused at the manners and customs of the Filipinos. That's just the little caption that was included here, almost as a postcard.
How did they distribute those?
I mean, they just mass printed them and just
and handed it out.
handed them out. Yeah, it's just, they call them like souvenirs. Yeah. So to further the colonial mindset a little bit more, we turn to who's eventually going to be a president of the United States, but was again the governor of the Philippines. And with regard to the education of them, he says, "One of our great hopes in elevating those people is to give them a common language, and the language English, because through the English language, certainly by reading its literature, by becoming aware of the history of the English race, they will breathe in the spirit of Anglo-Saxon individualism." So certainly a push to reshape the culture of the Philippine people. So the next period that we turn to is a big rush of immigration that occurred in the 1920s and 1930s. And in this period, it's important to see the Filipino male body as a laborer, and as a criminal, and as a sexual threat. The failing economic system for rural farmers in the northern region of the Philippines saw a mass exodus of rural farmers, mainly from the Ilocano region, and let's see. They had an American education, so they knew the Constitution, the American Constitution. They knew the Pledge of Allegiance. So they moved here with all these notions of liberty and freedom. They were essentially American, and however, they were met with severe discrimination. They were met with unfair pay, they were met with unfair hours, they were met with a housing discrimination in which they can live, and they were exploited for their labor because, as growers described it, the Filipinos were shorter, so they were lower to the ground, so they were more fitting for stoop labor, they called it. And the Filipinos, of course, were disillusioned at these things. So the reason I chose this picture was to show the different ways that Filipino men embraced their sexuality and their masculinity, particularly. Here you see them in fly suits and cool hats. They really adopted the consumerist culture of the United States amid all of these, I guess, limitations of how they can express their sexuality. And it's interesting to note that it was certainly frowned upon for any time a Filipino man would mingle with a white woman. So just to give a demographic sense of these Filipino laborers, majority of them were young, so about my age, in their early 20s. Majority of them were male, and majority of them were single. A lot of these people came as young laborers wanting to gain a lot of money and then eventually come back as rich to the Philippines. So what did they have in terms of sexual outlets? It was very limited because of anti-miscegenation laws. Anti-miscegenation laws were passed in the early 1930s, and it limited who Filipinos could marry. So a Filipino was, by law, could not marry a white individual. So to kind of escape these limitations, they went to gambling halls, they turned to prostitution, and they turned to taxi dance halls and had bachelor parties such as these, where they would partner with white dance partners and pay 10 cents an hour to dance with them, and eventually, if they get lucky, it would head towards sex at the end. So this riled up a lot of anti-Filipino sentiments amongst the community, the white community particularly. This is a sign, actually it was a postcard that was sent to the chief of police in Sunnyvale, California. Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down. And a cop from Seattle actually had this to say about Filipinos. The Filipino is bad by nature, he is criminal, their crimes are violent in nature. In addition, they intermingle with white girls more, especially with prostitutes. And this is a eugenicist. He was the founder of Cal State Sacramento, actually, and his name is C.M. Goethe. And he had this to say about Filipinos. Filipinos are vain, unreliable, and a rather low mentality. These men are primitive, jungle folk, and the primitive moral code accentuates the race problem. And the race problem led to violence. This is in Stockton, in which young white men bombed a clubhouse in which Filipino men gathered and met. I don't know how, but nobody died. And they stand on the rubble of this. It's an interesting thing when you're recording how many Filipino men died during this period. There was very few recorded deaths, but a lot came out later on when they would interview a lot of these laborers in their 90s, and they would recall Filipinos being lynched at times publicly to instill fear within the Filipino community, very similar to the tactics that you would see in the Jim Crow South. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so the worst, I think the most notable riot was the Watsonville riot, in which they dragged Filipinos out of homes and beat them, tossed them over bridges into the rivers, homes burned and looted, and drive-by shootings, which killed one young man, Furman Tobera, who was only 22. So let's move on to World War II, where you see the Filipino body as an instrument of war. So more than 250,000 Filipino men served in World War II. They were promised American citizenship by FDR. However, after the war, Truman signed an act that barred these Filipino soldiers their American citizenship. They weren't granted their citizenship until 1990, when George Bush Sr. Signed a new policy. That was 45 years after the war. However, all of these Filipinos still lacked the veteran benefits, the pensions, and the medical care that they were promised also, and that didn't come until 2009 when President Obama signed that into law, and that's over
Wow.
60 years after the war. Many of them already passed away, but Filipinos live pretty long, so they got their money, but definitely in a late fashion. Let's see. So let's move on a little bit closer. So as I mentioned, in 1965, the Immigration Act was passed that saw a lot of Filipinos to come to the United States, and it's important to see the Filipino male body as invisible and alien to him or herself. This is, of course, as I said, due in part to social, political, and economic pressures, and there's certainly a loss of culture. I've inherited this version of Filipino American identity, one that is detached from Philippine heritage, the language, the history. And Reagan, he pretty much the notion of the model minority for Asian Americans came from Reagan's speech in 1981 when he said, they, Asians, have lived the American dream and continue as exemplars of hope and inspiration not only to their fellow Americans, but also to the new groups of Asian and Pacific peoples who even now are joining the American family. We must realize that this American dream that Ronald Reagan speaks of often comes at the expense of Filipino and Asian American culture. Because we are alien to our own identities, we adopt the norms of other cultures, whether it be the hip-hop scene of the Black community or the middle-class suburban norms of white America. We become everything but Filipinos. We become everything, so we become invisible. It is in this invisible state that we exist in, and not only are we trying to be seen, but we are trying to be remembered. And as I mentioned before, I reflected on this history and these ideas and these personal experiences to create poems. So if it's cool with you guys, I'm gonna read a few of them. So how much time do I have?
8 minutes.
8 minutes? Okay, I'll read two. So this is called The Way of the World, and the title is taken from an advertisement from the St. Louis World's Fair, and these are Filipino villagers posing for the camera at the World's Fair. So, all right. The Way of the World. Man with high cheekbones looks away, pushing out a smile, standing in front of the oak tree and a hut. Flat nose, thick lips, copper skin, satin skin. Uncover them, let them show their skin, so beautiful. Strong chest muscles, great strength and power. Splendid specimens. Barbarian, though. Headhunter, though. Smallpox, of course, and 2 froze to death on the train, 1 suicide at the fair, the place that is called man's greatest achievement, homesick or just done with dancing to the pounding metal gong, dance of gut and spirit interrupted by laughter from women with white dresses, floral hats and parasols to shield their skin from the sun. Hot orb that colors these men and keeps them low, squatting next to the flame that boils a meal of unceremonious dog, keeps them low, feign attack with bent knees as the wooden bow they grip, pose for the picture. Keep them as dog-eating savages or don't keep them at all. Cast the souvenir to the floor and bury them with the dead zoo animals. So that was the first. Let's see. I'll go ahead and go with the third one. And this is called Savage is to Man, is to God. And it is, it's set in 1929 and 1930 amidst the Watsonville and Exeter anti-Filipino riots. And as I mentioned earlier, it ended up in the death of Herman Tobera, a young man of 22. So savage is to man, is to God. Tonight, God stained the moon orange. On naraniag abulan, a man sings, filling the room of a bunkhouse where men lay their wilted bodies, dusty boots and chafed hats. Tonight in Sunnyvale, the chief of police received a letter. Get rid of all Filipinos or we'll burn this town down. Sangsangit ko indingam. Some tell the man to shut up. Work is our domed backs, reaching for the ground, closer to the grave. Tonight in Exeter, a gang of men hold canisters of gasoline, led by a police chief, and they burn down a barn, the place swallowing itself, embers racing from its mouth. Toy nasibnek adubangko, the solo, now a chorus of several waking men. Tonight in Watsonville, police raid a home breaking doors, penetrating the room, overturning a lamp, chattering porcelain between two beds, the two white girls, and a Filipino man. Inka kad silawan, the men sing, closing their eyes, remembering a banana grove, a carabao wandering in an open field, a mother stroking his thigh, tapnon diak mayao awan. Tonight in Sacramento, Charles Gerda, a eugenicist, writes, Filipinos are of rather low mentality, their primitive moral code accentuates the race problem. No Inka naglipaten. Most of the men are now standing, some joining with mandolins and guitars. Tonight in Watsonville, Filipino bodies are plucked out of homes like wildflowers, ripped from the hungry ground, the pollen beat into the air as powder, floating over bridges into the river. Business owners erected signs to act as borders. Positively no Filipinos allowed. No dogs or Filipinos allowed. Karim kaniak nagwibusen. Some of the men are crying. A young man lays his head on the lap of a grandfather, looking out into the horizon of cabbage and the gory river of bodies, while they both cry. Cry for Pangasinan, Ilocos Sur, Ilocos Norte, Isabela, Cagayan, mother, father, brother, sister, lover. Tonight outside the bunkhouse, vigilantes park their cars, sinking into the wet soil like hooves of a waiting bull, and with their rifles and pistols they take aim. Perhaps the men with guns hear the chorus and pause to listen until the men inside the bunkhouse howl the line, Sam samitek ni patay, which means, I will choose death. But there was no way the men with guns knew this, but they fire anyway. The men in the bunkhouse huddle into a closet or drop to the floor, bullets whip through the wooden walls, barking at the moon, a jab at the cosmos that overcame their song. The grandfather is holding the young man, drawing lines on his face, touching his lips with knuckles as blood spews out of the young man's mouth, flowing down onto the grandfather's thighs, a canal of wine. The young man's eyes flash orange, men singing, O bulan ket aklunem, which means, O moon, you will know it such. Thank you.